In a recent video, I made a bit of a homing missile launcher. So I thought in this video, I would first go ahead and make a little tutorial on how to make this in your own world if you feel like it. And then after that, I will explain it to anyone who is interested. So to build this, you're going to need all three kinds of command blocks, a lever, a button, and at least one kind of block to build with. As a note before we get started, all of the commands are in a document that I've linked below in the description so that you can just copy and paste them all without having to listen to me read off like 20 commands. With that out of the way, you're going to want to start by putting down a repeating command block, making it so that it is always active, and then putting down 4 chain command blocks. And whenever you have chained command blocks like this, you're going to want to make sure that the block, or the command block behind them, has the arrow on the side of it facing into it. Otherwise it won't run. And once you have this little chain, you're going to paste the commands from mobs section 1, starting with the repeating command block, and just going down the line. Next up, you're going to put down a second repeating command block here. This one you can leave on needs redstone. And into it, you're going to paste the command from mobs section 2, and then put down a block and a lever on top of it. Next up, one more repeating command block. This one will be always active, and 5 chain command blocks this time. And into these, you're going to paste the commands from players, section 1, again starting with the repeating command block and going down the line. And next to that, you're just going to have an impulse command block and 1 chain command block. Into these, you'll paste the commands from players, section 2, and on top of the impulse command block, put down a block and then a button. And after that, you can just cover this up and decorate it however you feel like. And now, just a quick explanation on how to work this thing, because it's not entirely obvious. So, what you're going to want to have is a name tag named targeted, no caps. And if you have that, then as long as that lever is on, if you rename a mob using this name tag, it will summon a missile to follow it. For players, it's actually even simpler, although I can't really demonstrate it because I'm in a single-player world. But whenever you press this button here, it will summon a missile that will target the closest player that's not within like a certain radius, just so that it doesn't target you, it will target ideally the closest person off of this platform. And just like that, the tutorial is done. So next up, I'm going to explain how this all works for anyone who's interested. But before you go, if you're not, I would just like to ask you to consider subscribing if you found this video or any of my other videos interesting, because lately I've actually been having a good amount of fun making these kinds of videos, and it would be really cool if other people enjoyed watching them. So please just, let me know if you enjoyed this by subscribing or liking. Anyway, with that little shameless self-promotion out of the way, let me just take this ceiling off and try to explain what's going on in here. Now, what's important to note about this contraption is that there are 2 separate halves, actually, one for players and one for mobs. Just because the way that the 2 things are targeted is so different, I just decided so that it didn't get messed up, I would just make effectively 2 different contraptions for both. They work largely in the same way, but there are some minor differences that I'll go over. But, starting with entities, this command block right here is probably the most important. Each missile is actually an invisible armor stand that follows whoever is targeted, and this command block right here is what kind of powers the actual following. So what it does is it takes every armor stand who's tagged as missile, it only takes those ones so that we don't have conflicts with like other armor stands flying around, and it teleports them 0.6 of a block forward, facing towards the closest entity whose name is targeted. Name is targeted because, if you remember, the way we target entities is by renaming them to targeted. The next command is a command that checks at every missile if there is an entity whose name is targeted within 1 block, and if there is, it summons a TNT, so that kind of powers the detonation. This next command block is a little bit further down the line, but it's more related to the last one I just showed. It does basically the same thing, checks the same things, but instead of summoning a TNT, it just kills the armor stand, because before I found that sometimes the explosion wasn't enough to kill the missile, so it would just be hanging around. Going back one command block, we have a command that just has at every armor stand who's a missile, it makes a particle effect, and if you want to, you can actually change this particle effect to whatever you want it to be. I tried out a few things and I found that explosion looked the best, but you can have different opinions. Finally, this last command block down the line, it basically checks if there's any entities who are targeted, and if it's not, then it kills all the missiles. Because before I was having problems where it would summon a missile before the entity was dead for some reason, and then the entity would die, and you would just have a missile kind of floating in space with no one to target, and that was no good. So yeah, those 5 command blocks are all of the command blocks that sort of power the missile itself, but to launch the missile we have this command block. And what this command block does is it checks for any entities whose name is targeted, and if any of them exist, unless there's already a missile, it will summon a missile. And the reason I check for any pre-existing missiles is because I didn't want it to summon like a million missiles. I wanted something a little bit more conservative. If you don't like that, feel free to just delete that. You can do that and it will probably be crazy chaotic, but good for you if you want that. Going over to the player side, this set of command blocks here is very similar to these 5 ones here, in that they kind of power the missile itself, but I'm actually going to start with the launch procedure because it includes something very important, and that is this command block. And what that does is it simply adds a tag to the closest player who's not within 5 blocks, which ideally is the closest player who's not the one like controlling the missile launcher. It adds the tag targeted, and that is how we keep track of the player who is targeted by the missile at this moment. This next command block just summons a missile. That's all it does. So whenever you press that button, it'll tag the closest player to be targeted, and it will summon a missile to attack them. Next, looking at these 6 command blocks, the first 5 are very similar to these 5 for entities. The main difference is that instead of checking for entities, it checks for players at P instead of at E, and also it does tag instead of name, it checks. Because, again, it's not the name that we're changing to target a player, it's the tag. The other big difference is that all the missiles are tagged with missile P, P for player, rather than just missile, because, again, we have 2 separate kinds of missiles so that it doesn't, get confused and we don't have to worry about how the 2 kinds of missiles are interacting. There are just 2 completely separate kinds of missiles. And finally, this last tag, it removes the tag from a player effectively once they get hit, because it removes it from them when there are no more missiles. The reason I did that is because tags aren't removed through death, so if we didn't have this, someone would get shot once, and then they would just be permanently targeted by missiles until nothing. They would just always be targeted by missiles, and that's not quite ideal. But hey, again, if you don't want to do that, you can break this command block or just change it from always active to needs redstone if you want it to toggle more easily. And with that, I think I'm just about done explaining this as well as I can. But with that being said, I'm not very good at explaining stuff, so if you have any questions or any feedback about how I can explain things better in the future, feel free to let me know in the comments, and I'll do my best to answer. And yeah, I think that's just about it. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching. Hopefully I will see you soon.